Hello, and welcome to ConTinual, the never-ending convention. My name is Jean Marie Ward, and I'll be your host tonight for the panel room, Reclaiming Lovecraft. With me today are 5 writers who are mining the legacy of this problematic giant to create vibrant, diverse, and inclusive stories for a new and hopefully better age. Okay, first off, before we get into the questions and the discussion, I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves and tell us just a little bit about their work. First up, R.S. Belcher.
Hi, my name is Rod Belcher. I write under the name of R.S. Belcher. I currently have 4 series going. My first series was the Golgotha series, which is a weird Western series, which has Lovecraft influences in it. And then I also have another series called the Brotherhood of the Wheel, which is urban fantasy, which also has some Lovecraft influences in it as well. I've been writing, I was writing for journal. I was doing as a journalist and a freelance writer since 2001, and have been currently, I think I have about 10 books out, and a bunch of anthologies that I've been very privileged to work in. And I have a new book in the Golgotha series actually coming out this Thursday. So it would be the 8th, since we're time traveling in this. So
yes, we are.
But that's pretty much my background.
Yes, and congratulations on the new release. Nadia.
Thank you.
Nadia.
Hi, I'm Nadia Bulkin, and I have 1 book out. It's my collection, which is called She Said Destroy. It has a few Lovecraft stories in there as well. I started writing short stories when I was in college because I needed spending money. So that's kind of how I got to where I am now. So yeah, happy to be here.
Oh, great. We love having you. Okay. Ruthanna?
Hi, I'm Ruthanna Emrys. I'm the author of the Innsmouth Legacy series, which currently consists of Wintertide and Deep Roots, which are books that take some of Lovecraft's more famous monsters and have them in post-World War II, trying to rebuild the community that got destroyed when Lovecraft was writing about them, and also deal with the burgeoning Cold War. I also co-write with Ann Pillsworth a series of reviews of weird and Lovecraftian short fiction on Tor.com. Up until last month, that was called the Lovecraft Reread because it had started out with literally a reread of every single one of Lovecraft's stories. We just changed it to reading the weird, both to acknowledge that we have long since expanded that and following on recent discussions of exactly how centered Lovecraft should be in discussions of the weird.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a big issue. Craig?
I'm Craig Lawrence Gidney. I have 4 books out. I guess that I am the one person on this panel that doesn't explicitly write Lovecraftian fiction. It just is considered to be because it deals with color and the Numenus and all that. And so I'm not really influenced by Lovecraft, but sort of been put into that, into the wider weird tradition. Mm-hmm. My novel, A Spectral Hue, has to do with outsider artists and kind of deals with sort of hauntings and the use of art and color to access the divine. Mm-hmm. And I have a cosmic horror story coming out from Tor actually next week that I'm excited about.
Congratulations.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, basically, the outsider and cosmic horror are generally considered to be in the purview of Lovecraft.
Right.
You fit right in here. You certainly do. No apologies needed. Jordan?
Hi, I'm Jordan O'Hawk, and I am a trans and queer writer of a bunch of books in different series. But I'm best known for my Lovecraftian influenced Wyborn and Griffin series, which is currently carrying on a spin-off series, Wrath and Ruin. And for all you gamers out here, we actually have a Kickstarter going on that is based on the Widdershins universe of these two series, which is being headed completely by a person of color and trans and queer development team. So that is currently going on Kickstarter when this episode drops.
Very cool. Very cool. How did you first encounter Lovecraft? Jordan?
Actually, back in the early 90s, I believe it was Ballantine Books, put out a bunch of republication, and they had the Michael Welling covers on them with the very gray and then the red highlights. And I was like, I don't know who this guy is, but those covers are amazing. So I immediately snatched them up, and I think fortunately for me, I kind of by default started with his least problematic stories, and as I was going along, I was sort of like, this guy has some good ideas, but wow. But that's what really got me into it, was those republishing and just the amazing, back in the day before you could download a 20% sample, from your e-reader, it was like you were just taking a chance. So that's the covers are really what the Michael Welland is what brought me into it.
Hey, I know that the visuals are so important with regard to Lovecraft, because of the description of the monsters or how we view them from the movies, etc. So that was sort of what drew you in, the visuals.
Yeah, basically, the covers caught my interest. I started reading, and then the descriptive language, I think, is what really kind of hooked me, because I was like, oh, this is, he never met an adverb he didn't like. So, and that kind of very, sepulchral and, morbid description. I was a 80s goth, so that definitely kind of like, yeah, this is, my thing. And that kind of kept me reading.
Okay. Craig, I noticed that when Jordan said, those Michael Whelan cover books, you immediately started going, yes, yes. Did you encounter Lovecraft that way also?
The way I actually encountered it was, and I think Nadia knows the story because I told this earlier this week, that my younger brother was into heavy metal. And for some reason, Lovecraft and heavy metal go together like peanut butter and chocolate. And he happened to have the Whelan books, one of them, laying on his table. And so I picked it up, and I think I read The Outsider. And I loved that. It was so beautiful, and the language was mystical. And, it's one of the stories where the character actually seems to be okay with the fact that they're a freak, as opposed to most of his other stuff. And then the story immediately after that was, and I was petting my cat, Inward Man, and I took the book and threw it across the room. So, and I had to explain to my brother,
what happened to his book?
Yeah, right. Why it has a cracked spine, and it's because of this. And I never really went back to it, to tell the truth. I began to be interested in the people around him, like Clark Ashton Smith and other people who weren't as virulently racist as he was.
Yeah, I was always amazed that somebody as humane as Fritz Leiber. traced his literary lineage to Lovecraft. I mean, I was sort of surprised with Robert E. Howard, but, you know, it was like, Liber, really? You know?
Right.
Because he seemed like, in all of his stories, so much saner, even when he was doing something like Our Lady of Darkness. But yeah. So a question about what did you do when you first hit the stop button? Oops, that's going to come up later. Ruthanna, what was your first encounter with Lovecraft, and what drew you to him?
I came to Lovecraft quite sideways. In college, I was hanging out with a group of science fiction fans and role players, and many of the people there were very into Call of Cthulhu and the Illuminatus trilogy, and they had plush Cthulhus, and so I heard the jokes before I came to anything else.
Mhm.
But I was at the time a child of the late 80s. I was very into apocalyptic fiction. I actually met my wife around the same time in a class on films about nuclear wars. So the apocalyptic side of the Elder Gods was very appealing to me at the time. And it was several years before I actually thought, well, I probably ought to read the originals. I bet they're interesting. And that leads to, I think, probably the answer to the next question. So,
which is, yeah, what drew you to I'm sort of combining them here. What drew, since Jordan and Craig went in that direction, what drew you to, I mean, this tells you what drew you to read the books at all, but what did you like when you first encountered them?
yeah, so the way that I actually first read the stories was as I had made this decision that I ought to actually read them. What we did was, while I was making dinner every night, my wife Sarah would read the stories to me, and we would exclaim over the interesting stuff and make fun of the ridiculous stuff and critique the racism and other bigotries, and it was sort of an MST3K setup. But what appealed to me about them is I'm weird. I like Lovecraft's language. I think there's this energy to the absurd vocabulary and the just complete lack of self-consciousness about how everything he's describing is obviously scary, whether it's Cthulhu rising from the depths or this house. It's a century old. Deep time. The fall of civilizations. Gambreled roofs. And so I enjoyed that energy, and it also is legitimately incredibly original stuff. He was trying very hard to get past blood and guts and vampires and werewolves and come up with newer, scarier things. And he didn't always hit that ball, but when he did, there's things there that no one had come up with before, and some things that very few people have managed to hit since. So that is stuff that I have continued to appreciate as a reader.
I think I've heard him called the poet of dread or something on those orders. Yeah. Nadia, how did you first encounter Lovecraft, and what drew you to him? I'm hearing language. You know, this seems to be a thing. No apologies needed.
Anyway, so what my first exposure to Lovecraft was definitely not language. It was the movie Dagon, and which I really liked because it was so bold and creepy, and I loved the ending, which I think this kind of ties back to something Craig said about, like, your first exposure being something that isn't this horrific sort of like xenophobic thing, but in Dagon it's like he leans into it, right? And so because that was what I found most interesting about it, was that it didn't end on this like on a sad note, but on like a weirdly hopeful note of like he's finding his true place in the world, you know, look at all this possibility. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. And then I think I looked it up, and I think I thought it was a real religion because I saw mythos. I was not a very like exposed to a lot of things child, and I was like, oh wow, this is like a crazy religion and has like, you know, haunters in the dark and that kind of thing. Like that's cool. Like, are these like Christian demons? Also not Christian. So I get what's going on. And then once I found out it was fiction, I was like, oh. And I think I looked up a bit of it, and I was like, this is not my thing. But then I started trying to write, and at the time I was in that mode of like, you write to whatever is being asked of you, like whatever call of submission exists. And this was like in the late 2000s, and Sylvia Moreno Garcia was running this magazine, Innsmouth Free Press, where she had a very explicit, like she had a call once that was like multicultural Lovecraft. And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. And so I thought, I'll give it a whirl. And so I did. And that's kind of how I got into it, was a sort of a very like molding oneself to what is being asked for in the market.
Yeah, that's a very good way to get published. I mean, really, if you can mold yourself to the market. But Dagon actually was part of a real religion. He's a Sumerian god, and there's a reason he's got a fishtail, and it's not evil. It's because
that's so true. So true.
Yeah, he's just a river god. So yeah. Rod, what was your first encounter with Lovecraft, and what drew you to him, his stories, whatever?
Well, I was a kid of the 80s, and I was very much into D&D, and the group I started playing with, I was a kid. I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, and I'm playing with a bunch of college guys, and I was reading anything I get my hands on, and they kept on recommending these guys, and Lovecraft came up, and I have to admit, like everybody else, there is something really powerful in his language and the way he kind of builds this dread, and it's very impressive. And in some ways almost kind of poetic. It's amazing because Lovecraft there's a lot of contradictions in Lovecraft, because there is that language which is mostly admirable, sometimes a little over the top, but not quite as bad as some of his contemporaries. But the man sucked at dialogue. He really did. It was awful. Absolutely. Ye gods. Who the hell talks like who the heck talks like that? Sorry.
Hell is PG. You can say and it's appropriate in this context.
With dialogue in
don't use that language, kids, and don't do crack. But basically, I was reading at the same time I was reading Lovecraft. I was getting into like Fritz Leiber, who you mentioned, who I loved, and Arthur Conan Doyle, and Robert E. Howard. And actually, Lovecraft was kind of my gateway drug to Ambrose Bierce, who I really fell in love with. Because I really think he had the same kind of poetic ability to kind of build up this terror and dread. When I knew that I was going to keep reading Lovecraft was one night. This would probably been when I was like maybe 13, 14 years old. I'm in the house by myself. My mom was still at work. I had every light in the house was out. I had the little light over my bed on, and I'm reading The Color Out of Space. And I'm reading the part where he's describing how the forest and the animals were changing, and it got so immersive that I was reading this and I was really focused on it. And there was a windstorm outside, and this branch banged up against the window right behind my head, and I went, ah! And I threw the book. I literally threw the book, and nearly lost control of several bodily functions. Also, but that's when I was just like, okay, man, okay, yes, you got some chops, okay. So because a lot of stuff, I don't think I've ever had anything else really kind of hit me that way going forward. But I was really impressed that he could get me that deep into it.
Add dialogue or no?
No, the dialogue sucks. If you notice, most of his stuff is narrative. It's someone talking to you, and most of Lovecraft stuff is like very little, action. It's mostly just, I went and I was given some papers by this banker, and I read them.
And then I fainted.
Stunning, you're not going to see what's his name, Michael Bay or whatever, doing a Lovecraft story unless he like jazzes it up with some car crashes and explosions or something. But I did come to appreciate the language, and I have the same feeling for Clive Barker. Actually, Clive Barker can produce this beautiful, horrific, terrible, poetic language, and that is impressive. A lot of the other issues with his writing I came to, I guess, probably in the last few decades, and to be honest with you, I have not read everything the man has written. I've read quite a bit of the kind of the classics, but I think that it is unfortunate, but also kind of human that there is that contradiction. I think that he was a very screwed up individual.
Yeah, his biography supports that. Yes,
not just simply for his attitudes and his sort of his the way he came to view the world, but I really think that he had probably some aspects of mental illness, depression. Those are not excuses, but they do explain a lot of the things that I think kind of come along, the baggage that comes along with his writing. I do think that he has influenced generations of writers, and for good or bad. But I think he has done that, and I certainly influenced me when I got to do my first novel, which just happens to be right here next to me.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? This was my first shot. Tor published it. I got very fortunate. I feel like I won the lottery, but they published the first 3 books in the series, and Lovecraft was an influence on. I wanted to write a Western that was the most un-Western Western ever. I have lots of folks in there who are a lot of characters who are people of color. I have the mayor of the town is gay. I wanted to, the square-jawed, fair-haired sheriff is actually kind of like a minor character. He's not that prevalent in the book, at least in the first one. And there is a lot of Lovecraft. There are tentacles, and there's ancient cults and monsters and mind-destroying terrors from beyond time and space. And so the guy definitely influenced my work. And I think he's influenced a lot of people's work for generations. But that's how I came to him.
Mm-hmm. And what you did when you found out he was human.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much good stuff in the mythos he created. I mean, fertile stuff. There's so much stuff that can be kind of plumbed for horror and for weird tales, supernatural tales, and cosmic, kind of cosmic horror. pretty much he's synonymous with that genre. But it's sometimes disappointing to find out that the person who wrote these books that and it's not just Lovecraft. There's tons of authors who you love their work, but then you find out what the person's like, and you're just like, and that's sadly part of the human condition. I don't know how much he was influenced by his time period. Obviously, it was a very racist time period. And I don't know how much of it was also his own just being, I wish I could borrow Jordan's word, messed up. And he was a very messed up guy. So
Yep. Okay.
There we go.
You brought up cosmic horror, and that is your bailiwick, Craig. So, you threw the book against the wall just like I did. When you started to write cosmic horror, did you consciously go towards your memories of or images of Lovecraft, because he's pervasive in the culture, the sci-fi fantasy culture and horror culture, that is, or were you just doing your own thing and people started saying, hey, that sounds like? How did it work for you?
I say that it was the second thing more than anything else. What happened was, I consider my work to be more influenced by, say, Toni Morrison or that sort of thing. And I was kind of writing about the confluence of the numinous and the eerie and the awe-inspiring. And it's not just Lovecraft doesn't hold the patent for that. He holds the patent for certain things, but not for that. And I think a lot of people, when I started getting published, they didn't really know where to put my stuff. Is it magical realism? Is it this? Is it that? And so it seemed to gain most ground when I sort of began accepting myself in the weird fiction community.
Mm-hmm. And were you compelled to strike a particular path in weird fiction? Were there elements that you wanted to bring to the fore in weird fiction that you didn't feel were being adequately addressed?
Well, I never write in terms of polemics. It's always from the heart and the subconscious. But I began finding that all my characters were either Black or queer. And it wasn't to diversify anything. It's just whenever I was stuck on a character, I was like, what do I do? Oh, I know, I'll make them queer. And then automatically they came to life. And so it wasn't even, I didn't even want to go and diversify anything, at least at the writing stage. Mm-hmm. Now that there are, unfortunately, Lovecraft apologists / fanboys who seem to like more Lovecraft rather than just his work, now I kind of get a little mouthy. But before it was just totally, that's the characters that spoke to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, there is no wrong here. Anything that produces good work, however it comes out, that's good. Especially if it's for a better, working towards a better world. Jordan, the idea of getting romance out of Lovecraft, it just sort of busts my head wide open. Was that a conscious response to the less savory elements you found in Lovecraft, or was it a, hey, I like this world and I want to put romance in it? How did that all come about?
Yeah, it was more of the second, because the cosmic horror aspects of it, like I like his mythos and the things he came up with, but a lot of his cosmic horror centers around like, oh, I'm not the center of the universe as a white man.
Hello.
And it's like, I was like, well, duh. So that part of it never really was very interesting to me. But I was rebooting my writing career, and at the same time I was listening to a podcast that I very much recommend called HP Podcraft. And they basically went through basically everything he wrote and talked about the good things, in chronological order that he wrote it, and talked about the good things about it and also the really terrible things about it. So it was a really interesting critical evaluation of his work. So I was listening to that, and they got to the Dunwich Horror, and they made a joke about the main character, or the not main character, but the guy whose name I now cannot remember, getting together a posse of learned men to go take on the monster. And I thought, oh my God, that's hilarious. I would love to write a character who's just like some nerd who has to fight monsters. And then the idea wouldn't leave me. And so I'm like, well, who is this guy? And I ended up with this gay Victorian philologist / wizard and I'm like, well, I always put romance into all my books, so I'm like, well, he has to have a romantic foil, because the series is really about found family more than anything else. That's really at the heart of it. So that's sort of where it begins. So it was less a conscious choice that I would like to write this type of character, and this is the kind of story that I am interested in telling within these this flavor of mythos.
Which does have a lot that's cool. Nadia, I got the feeling when you were discussing your work a little bit earlier that your stories that are very female centric, and we both know that Lovecraft never met a woman he wasn't afraid of in fiction. I mean, seriously. We won't go into the other things that he was really afraid of, but he was definitely afraid of women. Was that your reaction to what you found in the work, or was it more of a conscious professional decision? And to go in that direction, or was it just because, hey, I'm a woman and I want to write about people like me?
It was that last one. I very consciously try to center female characters in my stories because I never used to read characters that seemed like me. I always felt like male writers just like really couldn't write women at all. And so it was kind of an isolating experience. And I think, once I found people like Shirley Jackson, it was kind of like, oh, I see, you got to do it yourself. And so, I really have made that kind of like a conscious like effort on my part. And so when I started, writing to Lovecraftian calls of submission, it was like, well, let's put women in here. I was just thinking about this actually, because all of my Lovecraftian stories, I think, have women at the center of them. And they all kind of lean into this idea that like, they're all obviously in a male dominated world, and the men are usually more afraid, sometimes for good reason. And in one of mine in particular, Violet is the color of your energy, which is based off Color Out of Space. It's told from the perspective of the wife who goes crazy and is locked up in the attic to become a monster. So it's from her perspective, and it's set in like modern Nebraska. I grew up in Nebraska, and it's like I think the favorite one that I've done is that one, because it shows how, or at least what I was trying to show was like, for her, it's liberation to, be turned into this like, cosmic, entity, creature, or whatever. It's not, it's not scary, because what's scary is her husband.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I've always sort of found that to be sort of a fun thing to do, is like kind of turn his fears on his own stories, you know, like what am I afraid of? I'm less afraid of, you know what I mean? Like I'm still afraid of all those things. Like I don't want to say that I'm like totally cool if, like, you know, some gigantic monster. I mean, that would be very scary, obviously. But there are also other fears, you know, that I have to live with, that he probably didn't, you know, and they were, you know, scared of, you know, interracial marriages. Like we all have our own tolerances. So yeah, that's kind of my perspective.
Mm-hmm. So, Ruthanna, yeah, you also put women at the center. In fact, your main character is a woman. I presume that's how you would describe your main character. And was this basically a decision to address not just the femininity that Lovecraft was so afraid of, but also his deliberate, shall we say, excision of a large percentage of the world's population by just categorizing them all, you know, as monsters? You know, was that a conscious decision, or did you, like so many of the folks, find that there was something entertaining in the mythos that you wanted to work in a more humanistic fashion, or did it just feel like fun to take all of that crazy and, you know, MST3K it to the max, and it sort of turned into something different?
So, like I said a few minutes ago, I started out with my wife reading these stories aloud to me. And the way that the Innsmouth Legacy stories came about was that eventually we got to Shadow over Innsmouth. And it turns out that among all of the information about Lovecraft that I had sort of taken up by osmosis, it had included, you know, his racism, his sexism. I'd seen some of that in other stories. It had not included that this extremely famous story that people talk about and riff off of constantly starts out with a report that this town has been raided by the US government. Everyone's been put in concentration camps. And then the rest of the story is making clear that Lovecraft thinks this was a great idea. It should be reassuring that these people are in concentration camps now. And that was the one that I just could not get my head past. By that point, I was invested enough that it wasn't just throw the book against the wall and forget about it. And one of the things that I find most inspiring is to be angry about a story in a complicated way. And I was really angry at that story. And I sort of stomped around and yelled about it for a while, and I posted on my live journal, which tells you when this was. The world probably doesn't need a story about oppressed fish people in concentration camps, right? And everyone said, no, we need this story. And so I wrote the first Afromarch story, which was terrible and has never been published. And then while I was shopping that around, I wrote Litany of Earth, which was meant to be a sequel to the story, which has at this point never been published and doesn't need to be, that was actually Afra in the concentration camp. So it was her voice that came first. And this was the unpublished story is one that I wrote in, I think, 3 hours of just towering rage at a guy who I couldn't yell at because he was dead.
And wasn't it a shame?
And so absolutely nothing about that story was like consciously reasoned out. It was, this is the voice that came to me, and this is the personality that feels alive in this situation. And so Afra is a woman because Aphra is a woman. And then when I was starting to flesh out her world and add other characters, it wasn't, putting together a pie chart, although I feel like one of these days that would be a fun way to write a story, but it was definitely a thought of, okay, I am writing about a fictional axis of oppression. And I know that it drives me nuts when the fictional axis of oppression is the only one that you see. But I'm really interested in intersectionality, and I'm really interested in oppression and bigotry as like psychological phenomena. It's a thing that is very dangerous to me, and I'm frightened of bigots, and I want to know why
drives them.
Why do they think that way? And exploring it through a dead white racist is
relatively safer.
Well,
you were taking on.
I ended up putting people who had other axes of oppression because that was a good way to explore. So what looks the same if you have someone who has certain sorts of power and others? What looks different? What happens when you get people on this fictional axis of having some types of power and oppression in a room with people who have different and more familiar ones? And so I ended up with queer characters and Jewish characters and African American characters and Asian American characters. And some of that also started out because if you put people in a fictional concentration camp in 1928 and they all either die there or are... Eventually you get to the point where you get real concentration camps in the US, and at that point it just makes sense for a government that's going into a war to try and be efficient about the whole thing. And so having Japanese American characters in there just followed organically.
Yeah, I can see that. And then to add an extra axis of oppression, you were going into the period with the House Un-American Activities Committee, and all of the intersecting axes of oppression, which were quite a few. What was the most surprising aspect of, basically starting with a rage character and suddenly finding yourself in your own universe? What was the most surprising aspect of that process?
The thing I can most remember being surprised by is as I was doing the historical research, just bumping into things that have changed so much in the intervening time. And some of those are, deep ways that bigotry plays out. And some of them were just thinking about the ways that societal norms can change so fast. So one of the minor pieces of research I was doing was I got to my first draft and I realized I had not made enough people smokers. So going back in and putting in the smoking, and I asked a friend who was a retired Harvard librarian, they wouldn't have been smoking in the rare book rooms, right? And she said they would have, and it took us 20 years of grandfathering after it was officially not allowed to actually get them to stop. And so it's reassuring in a way to think that things that can be so commonly accepted and so terrible do sometimes change.
Yep. Nadia, when you started and are continuing to turn Lovecraft's misogyny on its head and focus on the women, what was the most surprising thing you discovered in the process? Were there any surprises? There's no wrong answers.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of any. I think it led me down the path, like a more interesting path of horror, which is like when you lean into wanting the horror. I think that, you know, I think it was Lovecraft that sort of opened that possibility for me, and I think it's an interesting one. I think it's one that he probably didn't intend, but there it is. And I mean, somewhat ironically, like, it was actually in the framing, the like intensive sort of like power conscious framing of Lovecraft was how I got like a trunk story to be like sellable, you know. And sometimes, like, I think this most surprising thing for me about writing Lovecraft from the perspective of somebody who's, you know, a woman, biracial, etc., is like the fact that like it's such an easy, like, once you say that, you know, you're like, you're in. And sometimes, like, I find like at work, I have male coworkers who are like, who talk about, they're like, you know, oh, you write horror, have you heard of Lovecraft? And I'm like, yeah, bro, I've heard of Lovecraft, you know. I mean, it's hilarious. And then, I mean, like, there was one time when one tried to sort of be like, tried to like one up his knowledge of Lovecraft. And I'm like, this is not a game you want to play, my friend. Like, so it's, I mean, I feel like the most surprising thing is just kind of like the continued focus and sort of like obsession on Lovecraft. Like, this is the window in, you know, and like, oh my God, I can't believe you're writing Lovecraft. Like, and I'm just kind of like, all right, man.
Yeah, mansplaining in the science fictional world, yes. Anyway, Jordan, what for you has been the most surprising thing about working in a Lovecraftian vein, if you will?
Honestly, how hungry people are for these stories. I did not have, I was like, okay, I'm writing, Widdershins was the first book. It came out in December of 2012. It had no clear genre. It is set in 1897, but has, you know, paranormal Lovecraftian elements to it, and it's a romance. It's a queer romance.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, this is not, traditional wisdom says this is not something everyone is, you know, clamoring for, but it was really the book of my heart. So I was like, I'm going to write it and just see, you know, what happens. You can do that nowadays. And just how strongly people responded to it. Like, this is, to date, absolutely the most successful series that I have written by far. And just how much people want this idea where one of the, besides found family, which is a big concept, part of that concept is that the series is about the outsiders. Mm-hmm. So just to throw out an example, one of my favorite Lovecraft story probably is At the Mountains of Madness. Mm-hmm. But when I read it, and he's like, oh, those Shoggoths were terrible because they rebelled against the people who were literally keeping them enslaved. I'm like, go Shoggoths, you know, like, pull their heads off. Like, come on, you know, like, it's got a happy ending, for God's sake. It's a Lovecraftian story that has a happy ending, whether Lovecraft wanted it to or not. So a lot of it's my stories written from the perspective of, you know, who is the real monster. And most of the time it is, you know, the humans, you know, the rich, not necessarily rich, but almost always, you know, people who are like doing all this for power. And the idea of is, a lot of it is communities of marginalized people coming together and, you know, ultimately saving the world. And that includes the fish people and the, you know, the Shoggoth type gelatinous horrors bonding together. And it's like that people are really receptive to that, and to the idea of the found family, and that sometimes that found family has tentacles, and The idea of a long-term bond between people that can lead them to do great things. People are really hungry for that. And I think that's why the series did well. I think that's why the Kickstarter for the RPG is doing well. It's not something that I ever predicted, but people, like I said, people are really hungry for that kind of story, something that, you know, talks about coming together instead of breaking things apart.
Yep, it is interesting. There seems to be a never-ending hunger for Lovecraft. Craig, what, when you've sort of made a niche for yourself in cosmic horror, a Lovecraftian genre, if not directly related, what have you found to be the most surprising aspect of your writerly journey in that regard?
I'd say, like Jordan said, that people are actually interested in reading about marginalized people. I think that when I was growing up, I never saw Black people or queer people or anyone that wasn't sort of like a square-jawed wasp type hero. And a lot of times I was not, to tell the truth, when you're growing up, you're just like, oh, well, is that even allowed? And then when I discovered, say, Samuel Delany or Octavia Butler, my mind was blown wide open and I couldn't shut the door. The other thing that I think is surprising is that how much people like fiction that doesn't fit in one category or another. That's the one thing. It's neither fish nor fowl. My particular things are, it says on the back of my book that it's a horror book, but I actually don't think it's a horror book. I think it's a book about found family and inspiration. But some people find that, creepy at the time. So I also think it's surprising at what people take from it too.
Mhm.
I wasn't really aware of that when I wrote it and published it. I wasn't really aware of the sort of found family aspect of it until someone wrote an article about it, and I was like, "Oh, okay," and then I accepted it.
Great, yeah. Rod, what has been the most surprising aspect of your use of Lovecraftian themes and horrors?
I've been writing notes because I kept hearing things that were jumping out at me that I was very excited to hear about. Some of the things that Nadia and Craig and Jordan were mentioning, I'll maybe make a little note here. The third book in Golgotha is called The Queen of Swords, and it's centered around one of the characters from like the ensemble. It's basically like a solo book. And the villain, the bad guy, is Typhon. It's the Typhonian beast, and he has kind of a connection to the sort of existential horrific thing that shows up in the first book. What I found really interesting is it's set in the early 1870s, and the character, it jumps back and forth quite a bit, but what I've gotten more feedback on is not the Typhonian beast. It is the story of this character going back to her home in South Carolina to her father basically kidnapped her daughter. Her husband is dead. He kidnapped the daughter, and he is in control of her inheritance since her husband died, because the law was a woman couldn't possibly hold property and money and be able to do all of these things. So that fight and that conflict, her fighting against the system, And I managed to drag in Arabella Mansfield, who was one of the first female lawyers in the United States. And I had her kind of come in and be my character's advocate. But that fight against the system seems to have, engendered a lot more. I get a lot more comments and feedback on that than I do on this kind of Lovecraftian monster that is also part of the book. I found that really, fascinating. And when I write the Golgotha books, I'm doing a lot of historical research, and it is just stunning how much things were just completely out of skew, and it was just no one even blinked. No one seemed to even notice that was in the power structure. So I found that there are scarier things than unspeakable horrors from beyond time and space, and they seem to resonate a hell of a lot more with people than those things do. I really enjoy kind of holding these things up in the books and going. The one that's coming out this week deals with the Ghost Dance movement, the first Ghost Dance movement, which led into the second Ghost Dance movement, and it's just there are things that there are almost like tropes in Lovecraft that are effective and can be powerful, but I do seem to think it seems that the evil that resonates from human beings being horrible to other human beings seems to stay with the reader a hell of a lot longer than the monsters do. And in a way, I think that's kind of ironic and kind of wonderful. So that's about it. That's what I got.
Okay, that's good. Okay, as you know, I've been sort of combining some of the questions because your in-depth answers are so fascinating to me. So we are coming up towards the close. And so I'm going to get to the question that for me is the heart of this panel. As a nation, we're currently wrestling with the inhumanity and injustice of our history and the systemic racism and inequity of our present. Are there lessons from your experience of reclaiming or reinventing Lovecraft that could help us come to grips with our past and forge a better future? Ruthanna, I'm going to start with you because I think that these are some of the questions you've been dealing in your tour column. You've been dealing with in the tour column. So I'm going to ask you to kick this off and sort of use it as your final thoughts as I go back around the virtual room.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there is something more general here that is worth applying to real life politics. And part of that is that the way that I deal with problematic literature is something that, for me at least, it comes from the way that Jewish culture and religion tends to deal with reading and interpreting the Torah. This is this ancient, important, deeply problematic set of ideas, and how do we explore it and rethink it to make it what we need it to be for a project of becoming more moral over time rather than being attached to whatever the limitations were of the originally.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the United States has horrible things, not just in its origin, but that have continued to percolate down, and people talk about slavery as an original sin, but it's not just that. You know, this stuff, as I'm sure everyone here is very familiar, you know, continues to percolate down through Jim Crow and the modern prison system and this whole intricate set of laws and customs that maintain these original horrors under the guise of respect for elder systems. And we do see that same thing in weird fiction, that people are very attached to this idea of originalism and respect for elders, but are using it as an excuse for prejudices and bigotry and racism, sexism, etc., that continue to be very modern things. And for me, part of being someone who engages with this problematic stuff is having a great deal of respect for people who don't want to read Lovecraft, who don't want to, in the middle of being oppressed in the modern US, say, oh, but here are all the good things about it, and the fragility of people who, every time you say word one against Lovecraft, say, you're trying to erase his legacy, really feels very much of a piece with the people who were shocked and horrified when Michelle Obama said that she had just for the first time felt proud to be American. Like, how could an African-American woman say such a thing? How could anyone ever say that they were anything other than proud to be part of this perfect system? And that's not how you make something good. Mm-hmm. So I could probably go on about this for a very long time, and I won't, because I'm sure so could everyone else. But I do think that we do need to think in terms of reclaiming and deconstruction and reconstruction when we try to make something good out of something that started out with such twisted roots, but with things that may be worth building something with.
Yes.
They want to be worth building something with.
That we hope are worth building something with. Yes. Jordan?
Well, to give this some context, the name of the first book, Widdershins, is also the name of the town that most of the action, every other book takes place in Widdershins. And there's a reason I made a very deliberate choice to portray, especially at the end in book 11, that the problems are not solved by like a lone hero coming in. Yes, Wyborn is the main character, and we see stuff from his viewpoint for the most part. We also see some from Griffin's viewpoint, but the reclaiming of what the world should be from people who are only interested in their own power and self-aggrandizement is a community effort. Like, it's very, I try to make it very explicit that this is everyone coming together to solve this problem against the people who would, you know, again, only think of themselves. And when I am writing a spin-off series, which the first book, Unhallowed, came out in July, it takes place 8 years after the big battle at the end of Wyborn Griffin series. And I wanted to do that to show the world that they had built. Mm-hmm. So within this town, it is still anchored in 1910 America, but within this town, the world that they fought for to be a more inclusive world and a place where you could be yourself was very much, I wanted to show that they did that they succeeded. So part of it's from the perspective of an outsider coming in and expecting things to be very different. And then, you know, in case people have not read the first series, you know, taking them through, well, this is how this world is, because I wanted to show people that you can make a better world, but like no specific person is coming to save you. It's kind of on all of us. And some of us are tentacle monsters to come together and do this. That was a very, very deliberate choice that I made in the series.
Okay, cool. Community.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Craig, what lessons from your experience of working and reinventing cosmic horror do you think are applicable to helping us heal ourselves and improve as a nation?
I'm going to actually talk about Lovecraft Country for a
Okay.
second, because the series that was made out of Matt Ruff's book,
Yes.
one of the things that it did, I have not been watching it, but I saw the free episode. And one of the things that they did at the first episode, I think that sort of, I don't know if it carries through, but it makes it clear that the laws of Jim Crow, which the Black family have to deal with, were sort of arbitrarily adhered to. Like sundown towns, while real, they weren't a legal thing. You couldn't legally do things like that. But because police officers could do whatever they wanted to do, and they had the power. And that's kind of what we're seeing now, particularly with Black Lives Matters and things, is that a lot of people think, oh, but they're the police. Well, you know, they can lie. And they do frequently. And there's this entire world that, as a person of color, you have to navigate that other people don't have to navigate. And so it by and large is unseen. I've always sort of called racism in many ways as like the monster in It Follows. And if anyone saw that movie, it's this monster that can take the form of anybody, but other people can't see it. And this is the kind of what it's like happening now. Now with cell phone cameras, we're now seeing things like, you know, someone saying, I have a gun in my apartment, in my car, and then the police officer immediately shoots the person. Or a kid is playing with a toy gun and then he gets shot. We're seeing those sorts of split seconds, and how sort of how Blackness is pathologized, and how cruelty sort of against Black people is kind of normalized, because we're obviously the monstrous, the other. So I think that Lovecraft Country is, at least the book, from what I remember, does a good job of explaining that, yes, the systems created by sort of white supremacy are every bit as insidious as monsters. And sort of connecting that to Victor LaVale's The Ballad of Black Tom, which imagines the horror of Red Hook from the viewpoint of an immigrant, is like, Cthulhu or racism? Cthulhu, come on. You know, what is worse? I'd rather that wipe them out than anything else. So I think that's one of the things that you can get from that, and from this sort of reclamation. Another retelling would be, what is her name? Kidge Johnson's The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow is another retelling from a female perspective. And she goes into some interesting places with that. And when you read that, you don't get the dread, you get that it's kind of a beautiful, magical, but dangerous world. And ultimately, the person who, well, I don't want to spoil it, but yeah, it does have a feminist ending to it.
Okay, okay. Rod, what do you think? What lessons can have you, from your experience of reclaiming and using Lovecraft, could help us come to grips with our past and forge a better future?
Craig is a hard act to follow. I'm going to say that right now. He's a hard act to follow. I think this year has chewed up a lot of people. I think that it is. Oh, there's explosions outside my window. Speaking of speaking of bad years, there seems to have been, an awful lot of. It feels very apocalyptic. It feels like things are kind of,
The elder
the
gods
sinner's
are
not
waking.
holding. Things are falling apart. The sinner cannot hold. And one of the things that I think is a little, well, one thing I try to keep in mind, I've tried to keep it in mind all year, is there was a book by Alan Moore, and I forget who the artist was that was working with him, but it's basically called Signal to Noise. And it was a graphic novel about a guy who was a filmmaker, and he was producing a film about this village in Europe on the eve of the end of the millennium, and how all the people in the village were coming out basically because they thought the world was ending, because things were so horrible and terrible. And he also, in the course of the book, finds out he has terminal cancer. So he's trying to find some meaning to go forward and finish this piece of art that he's doing when it all seems so pointless to him. And one of the great lines in there is, it's always the end of the world for someone. That, the world is always ending for someone, somewhere. And in a way, this year is a great opportunity for things to get made right that have been wrong. I think that one of the things that's very interesting in Lovecraft is the monster that's going to destroy the world. A lot of times the monster is not defeated. It's simply put off for a little while. And that resolution is usually by individuals. It's not by a government. It's not some secret agency that comes in and saves the day. It's a bunch of woefully inadequate people who, in spite of the fact that they are so scared they are about to lose their mind, they still manage to press on and save the world, even if it's for another 10 minutes or another year or another 10 years. And I feel like that's what we're seeing a lot out there now, is people are, as individuals, are standing up and finding other people who are willing to press on with them and try to make things better, try to save the world. So as I can't even use the S word, as terrible as this year has been in so many ways, there is, I do feel like there's been a change, and I do feel like that's something that's not going to go back. I think some systems have been broken, and hopefully when you break something, you take it apart to look at it to see how you can put it back together better. And that's my hope. And Merry Christmas to all of us. And I guess that's all I got. I'm
Okay.
done. I'm tapping out.
You can't tap out yet. I'm going to have to ask you about where to find you on the web in a minute. But before we do that, Nadia, what from your experience could help us come to your experience of reinventing Lovecraft could help us come to grips with our past and forge a better future?
I'm going to piggyback on something Ruthanna said about sort of how Lovecraft is like received in the genre and all this kind of stuff. Because I don't find very much I don't know, edification in Lovecraft himself at all. So I think it's always been interesting to me, like the very, very polarized reaction to him. And I think that that's also very applicable to today, especially as we kind of grapple with our history. I come from sort of a liberal arts background. So for me, when I learned that Lovecraft was this terrible person who had terrible ideas, I was like, okay, well, they all do, like, I mean, really, like that was like not a surprise to me, and I read a lot of post-colonial literature, and half of that is like, was totally racist, but like still has literary value. I mean, that's like the entire thing. That's like the entire Western canon.
Right.
And so I was just kind of, I'm used to that sort of angle. And I always found it very interesting that in fandom, that angle is like not allowed. It's either like, you never speak of Lovecraft, he is never, whatever, he is persona non grata, or it's like, he is the god, of all things, and we must never speak ill of him. And I'm just like, this is very strange. Like, and I think that, when we think about our past and founding fathers and, the discussion of like statues being pulled down, for instance, and revising things and, renaming things. I'm not going to get into renaming things because I think that's, complicated. But like, I do think that we need to get to some sort of ground where we can talk about history without deifying or demonizing. I mean, like, demonize the parts that need to be demonized, but like having, like, let's stop deifying people, perhaps, because then it makes you say, oh, the whole thing, like, I am not a person who wants to put Lovecraft on a bust, like, I don't think we need to do that.
We don't need the big ugly head.
I don't think we need the big ugly head. And I think that goes for a lot of, American history. I think we need to know it, because if we don't know it, then how can we possibly, understand where we are now? So, it's interesting to me how much there's this like a struggle to walk that balance. But I think we're going to need to find it, because it's the only way forward. If we just Control Alt Delete, I mean, that doesn't help anybody in like actual life. But it's also like, how are you going to stop that from happening again if you just pretend you're not capable of it?
Those who
nothing about humanity has fundamentally changed.
Yes. Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, to quote Santana, I believe it was. But very good point. All good points. And we're coming up to the end. I know that I had to compress questions because these are big issues. These are interesting thoughts and interesting books you're all writing. But we only have about an hour. So I'm going to ask you quickly, again in alphabetical order, to tell people where they can find you on the web, starting with you, Rod.
Sorry, I had to find my little button. Sorry. Let's see. I have a website which is rsbelcher.net. It is woefully out of date, and I'm in the middle of trying to update it, but it is there. You can also find me. I have a YouTube channel which is called The Knave of Pens with author R.S. Belcher. Or I think it's just with R.S. Belcher. That's available on YouTube. We talk about writing and anything else that happens to come up. Those are probably the two best places. I'm on Facebook under author R.S. Belcher, and I'm on Twitter under author R.S. Belcher. So come find me, and we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Okay. Nadia, where can folks find you on the web?
Yep, yes. So I have a website, nadiabulkin.wordpress.com. Pretty easy. I also have a pretty unique name, so you're probably not going to find anybody else if you Google me. I'm also on Twitter, where I write movie reviews that people find amusing.
Cool. Oh, very cool. Is it Nadia Bulkin on Twitter?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. Ruthanna, where can we find you on the web?
I have a website that, like Rod's, is woefully out of date, RuthannaEmrys.com. The best place to find me actually doing things right now is on Patreon, where I'm there under Patreon/Ruthanna Emrys, and I answer questions in character and as myself, and also seem to have somehow started writing a coffee shop AU of Aftermarsh stories there, because that seems to be what people want in this day and age. So, and you can also find me on Twitter under r_Emrys.
Cool, cool. Craig, where can people find you?
My website is craiglawrencegidney.com, and the Lawrence is spelled a unique way. So it's LAURANC. So there's a U, not a W. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Ethereal Lad, one word.
Okay, very good. Jordan, what about you?
My website is jordanlhawk.com, and I am on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, and Patreon as Jordan L. Hawk. And if you're interested in the Kickstarter I mentioned for the Widdershins tabletop game about Eldritch Horror found family and maybe kissing Eldritch Horrors, that's completely up to you as a player. Go to Kickstarter and search for Widdershins, the role-playing game, and that should take you to it.
Okay, great. So we have come to the end of a woefully short hour. Thank you all. And thank you all out there who are watching. If you enjoyed today's show, please like, share, follow, subscribe, or leave a review. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you.